An attractive feature of Aristotle's virtue ethics is the idea of habituating people to be well disposed and to conduct themselves with good behavior toward fellow citizens, without depending on complex, impractical philosophic systems. But he is vague concerning the means to achieve the goals of civility. Aristotle is also indistinct when defining the virtues. Socrates would question Aristotle's theory by first asking him what he meant by the term the good. Socrates would attempt to arrive at a precise definition of each of the 9 virtues. Critics have noted that Aristotle merely indicates the whereabouts of virtue. He is not prescriptive enough about what we, as virtuous people, are supposed to do. In his famous volume, The Nicomachean Ethics, 350 BCE. Who is a good person and how can she be recognized? The good person, invested with the virtues, is supposed to know what to do in a given situation. But the argument becomes somewhat circular. The good person will know what to do because he is good. Despite the indeterminacy noted, the philosophy is still influential. Neglected for many years, virtue theory is presently being examined as a viable ethical system. It is of interest to secular people because it is a moral system that does not need underpinning from a god or supernatural impositions. The second normative system of ethical philosophy is deontology, exemplified by the ideas of the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant, arguably the greatest philosopher of the German Enlightenment and one of the greatest philosophers of all time. Kant's moral system is seen by some non-believers as quite operative without a God, but Kant himself thought that morality depended on a belief in God. It seems possible that a deontological system could work without a transcendental other. However, John Rawls' Theory of Justice, 1971, a deontological social contract, is informed by Rawls' earlier Christian beliefs. Kant's theory is such an important facet of ethics that an unbiased examination of its precepts is in order, particularly since it is arguably viable without the concept of a superior being. Kant believed in what he termed goodwill, an important facet of his system of ethics. Goodwill is intrinsically good, independent of self-interest or desire to do otherwise. Actions, too, are intrinsically good because of their motives, and those motives must derive from duty rather than from consideration of consequences. He states, "Duty is a necessity to act out of reverence for the law." The law Kant refers to is the moral law, and the importance of that law is that it has universality. It can be applied to all people in all situations under every set of circumstances. Kant originated the famous idea of the categorical imperative, which is the foundation of his philosophy. He states, "Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law." He means that each person, by her decision to act in a certain way, determines that everyone, now and in the future, should act according to this rule. Borrowing money, knowing you will not be able to pay it back, exemplifies the concept. However, excluded is borrowing in good faith and being unable to make good on your debt. But what if everyone acted in this manner? Borrowing and knowing you will not be able to pay it back. You too could eventually be defrauded. Therefore, a rational person will not borrow in bad faith. Kant concludes with making the same point about lying. It is not permissible even in the most exigent situations. An important part of Kantian philosophy is the obligation to treat other people as ends and not merely as a means to something. The rule of end in itself places great value on human life. Similarly, Kantian ethics emphasize that the moral obligations the autonomous will imposes on itself should be considered morally binding on itself and on others. These obligations, he states, are chosen by reason. Kant's ethical system up to this point seems to be quite functional as a secular philosophy. However, in the end, Kant commits himself to the serious transcendental position that although truth with regard to humanity and God are beyond human reason, people cannot function as moral beings if they do not believe in God, freedom, and immortality. Kant decided to criticize reason, and I quote, in order to make room for God. A well-known criticism of Kantian objective teleological moral theory is that it is only dressed up popular morality. Jeremy Bentham, the 18th century utilitarian philosopher, charged that deontology attributed morals that were really subjective to natural law or universal reason. Other critics note that deontologists are bound by constraints such as never lying, which can lead to immoral results. Would it be wrong to lie if one could save a worthy person's life by telling his potential murderers that he had turned into the street on the left rather than the one he had actually turned into, the right? Some critics maintain that the options permitted by Kantian moral system are socially insensitive. A person has the option to never give money to the poor if he does not desire to do so. Some contemporary deontological philosophers are Thomas Nagel, Thomas Scanlon, and Francis Kahn. Social contract theories such as John Rawls, considered by some scholars to be deontological, will be discussed below in a section designated Social Contract Theory. The third normative ethical theory is utilitarianism, a universal teleological system calling for the greatest good for the greatest number. The atheist philosopher Jeremy Bentham wrote Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation in 1789. Bentham sets out to make law and morality scientific. He maintains that humans are governed by the two principles of pain and pleasure, and that people seek pleasure and avoid pain. He states that laws should be passed only if they maximize pleasure and minimize pain for the vast majority of people. In moral philosophy, this idea is called consequentialism. An act is judged good or bad by its consequences. He invented a sort of philosophic calculus which would attempt to measure happiness. The calculus would ask how intense the happiness was, how long, how likely to occur, side effects that would be unpleasant, and etc. Bentham was followed by a pet pig, and some jesters gave his theories the name of pig philosophy because of its emphasis on rather hedonistic, populist pleasures. John Stuart Mill refined Bentham's ideas, as he was not in agreement with Bentham's populism. Mill, who wrote On Liberty in 1858, is considered a rule utilitarian because he thinks it better that ordinary people should obey traditional rules rather than calculate what they should do at all times. But the rules that should be obeyed are those that create, from experience, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Mill was a non-believer in religion, stating that his father had told him not to ask who made him, because the next question would have to be, who made my creator? Mill was a great pluralist. He wished to see an open society with different types of people, all free to follow individual lifestyles. He feared the tyranny of the majority, as he wrote in On Liberty. Mill wrote Utilitarianism in 1863. He attempts to elevate utilitarianism into a philosophy that prioritizes the so-called higher pleasures. His version of eudaimonia defines happiness as coming from intellectual, aesthetic, and social enjoyments, as well as from the avoidance of pain or discomfort. He speaks about two types of pleasure, the lower, or elementary, such as eating, drinking, resting, and sleeping, and the higher, intellectual activity of scientific and creative occupations and the pursuit of knowledge. The lower pleasures lead to pain if overindulged in, and are not as lasting or satisfying as the higher. He states it is better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, and a Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Utilitarians believe that morality and law were made for man, not man for morality and law. They think that justice must serve human needs. The early utilitarians were advocates for the poor being helped, women liberated, and prisoners rehabilitated. All these good things were to be pursued in the name of utility, to ameliorate suffering and promote more pleasure and happiness. There are two principles involved in utilitarianism. The first is consequentialism, that the rightness or wrongness of an act is determined by the goodness or badness of the results that flow from it. In other words, the ends justify the means. There are many positive aspects to utilitarianism, a secular ethical philosophy. One of its most attractive principles is that it offers one single system for action. Do whatever promotes the most utility. Utilitarianism seems to arrive at the core of promoting human progress and reducing suffering. There are many influential neo-utilitarian moral philosophers at present: Sam Harris, Peter Singer, and Kai Nielsen, among others. Harris and Singer's ideas will be discussed below. Nielsen asserts no rules are sacrosanct. He believes every situation calls for a different response. He thinks that there is a possibility any rule can be overridden, even though he admits that we have to protect a few absolutes for the good of society. Nielsen also believes that utilitarianism should encompass negative responsibility, that we are responsible for our non-action as well as our actions. There are many salient objections to utilitarianism. The first is the no-rest problem. The no-rest difficulty is in trying to choose what is best for the greatest amount of people's happiness. Should one go to the cinema or spend time helping the homeless? If I make $100,000 a year, what portion, if any, should I donate to the poor? Another objection is the one brought by Bernard Williams, the philosopher. If a person has an obligation to be of utility to the greatest number of people, would he then violate his integrity by killing one individual to save 19 others? John Rawls makes a strong point in his false analogy argument against utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is prescriptive. It makes a demand of people beyond personal choice. It can prevent you from buying the jewelry you might want to help pay for the good of the community. It can also extend the futurist ideas of agent utility in a way that violates individual rights, which is very problematical. Another objection is that of intent. If a surgeon operates on a patient and the patient dies, we do not blame the surgeon if he has acted competently and in good faith. So, how can we judge a moral action by its consequences alone and not its intent? Critics have noted that moral action implies intent. Utilitarian theories continue to thrive during the present time. Utilitarian philosophy has been modified, weakened, and criticized, but remains an attractive philosophy for the secular community.